Thank you so much for joining us today in the latest installment of the program on US, China, and the World Speaker Series, where we're really lucky to have a conversation entitled Navigating International Research Partnerships in Choppy Geopolitical Waters, something we are all learning how to do in real time, the Swedish experience. Our guest today is Dr. Erik Forsberg, the STINT representative in China and ASEAN. Dr. Forsberg has been the STINT representative there since 2018, and he's worked in China for over 17 years. He was the founding vice director of the Sino-Swedish Joint Research Center of Photonics at Zhejiang University, and has also served as a postdoc and associate professor there. His research focuses on photonics and nanoelectronics, as well as research policy, international cooperation, and science diplomacy. And I think we'll be hearing about all of those topics today. And he's here on behalf of STINT, which is the Swedish Foundation for International Cooperation in Research in Higher Education, which was established in 1994 to make Swedish research and higher education more international. They've been especially active in the area of research security, which is a major interest of our program here at Hoover, and has advocated for a position of responsible internationalization that has been very influential in the global conversation about these topics. Erik, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. So the teacher in me is used to standing up, but I'll do my best doing this sitting down, right? So as Glenn mentioned, STINT is a foundation that was set up by the Swedish government 32 years ago with the purpose to support Swedish academia to internationalize. We were set up by a one-time endowment of 1 billion Swedish kroners, and we've by now spent more than that, and we still have almost as much left. I should stress that while we were set up by the Swedish government, we are completely independent. So what we did originally was to support internationalization was to use our money to give away grants to allow Swedish researchers to go abroad and working with partners in other parts of the world. But as I'll get to soon in this talk, as the world has changed over the years, so has STINT. We've evolved from being only a funder to being some sort of hybrid between a think tank and a funder, because we believe it important to support Swedish academia with knowledge and understanding of what happens in the wider world and the changes that are taking place. As in any relationship, so also in research partnerships, it helps to know your partner. And originally, this work was perhaps mainly focused on promotion about research partnerships and promotion of regions and countries we thought were interesting and perhaps overlooked. Of late, our work is also centered a lot on helping managing and sustaining research partnerships in somewhat less positive times, if you can say it like this. So if we look then on how things have changed for Sweden during the 30+ years STINT has been active. So when STINT was founded, research in Sweden wasn't particularly international. Perhaps that was one of the reasons we were founded. So roughly 30%, a little bit more of research done in Sweden or other publications that came from Swedish universities were co-publications with researchers outside Sweden. Since then, this share has grown to about 70%. So Sweden is now highly international in its research. I guess we, as STINT, can take some credit in that development. So who we work with hasn't changed that much over the years. In 1996, our main scientific partner was the US, and the US remains our key partner. The volume of collaboration has, of course, grown, but not necessarily who we work with. The US is our number one partner, the UK number two, Germany number three. And throughout most of this past 3 decades, this has been followed by a clutch of other European nations. The one change that has taken place is that China has risen from being an insignificant partner to now Sweden's 4th largest research partner. One should put that in perspective, though. The distance, as you can see in the graph, between China and the 3rd largest partner in Germany still substantial, right? But China has now passed by Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands as a research partner. So the situation we find ourselves in right now is that Sweden's research system is highly internationalized, as I mentioned, and far more so than the major science nation, and also more than most European nations. Our main partners, as I mentioned, are the US, UK, Germany, China, and then a clutch of other European nations. Sweden's research tends to be of high quality. We spend quite a lot of our GDP on R&D, 3.4%, which is at the higher tier within Europe. We get quite a lot from what we spend. The citation performance of research coming out of Sweden is high. We have if you look at the field-weighted citation impact, we're quite high compared to our peers. We also have high levels of researcher per capita. I think number 3 in OECD, and the number of publications per capita coming out of Sweden is also significant. So we can sort of summarize where Sweden is. So Sweden is a high quality, highly internationalized research system. Our strengths are, we could argue, openness, global integration, and the impact of what we do. We do face some challenges. As I'm sure most of you are aware, Sweden is a rather small country, so scale is an issue. And what has been, and I would argue still remains, our strength, openness, and global integration is unfortunately starting also to be a challenge, right, given how the world is turning. But that's where we find ourselves. And then we can also look at how the world has evolved during the time STINT has been active. So in 1996, was it 2 years after STINT was founded, the world looked like, or rather the world of science looked like this, where the colors, the countries on the map that are colored in blue are the countries that at the time contributed significantly to the global total of high impact research, not the global total of research, but the global total of high impact research, right? The best research in the world. We can see that. So, for instance, Sweden contributed with about 2.6% to the global total of high impact research in 1996. The United States was extremely dominant, contributing more than 51% of the global total of high impact research. And we can see that what is, at least for us that are a little bit older, a familiar picture, that the world of science was dominated by North America and Europe. But if we fast forward to present day, the map has changed significantly. The share of North American and European countries to of our share of the contribution to the global total of high impact research has shrunk. In the case of the United States, quite significantly, from 51% down to 18%. And a number of new countries have entered the fray, so to speak. The South Korea, Saudi Arabia, India, and of course, most noticeably, China, that now contributes almost 44% to the global total of high impact research. So a very significant shift of how the world of science looks like. And we can clearly see that the global center of gravity of science has migrated towards Asia. So this is how sort of a geographical look at it. We can also look at this shift in terms of which universities are leading the fray, so to speak. Like so we can look at this in several different ways. An easy way is to look at the Nature Index and see which are the top research universities in the world. 2015, the picture still looks rather familiar. The usual suspects on top is Harvard, Stanford, MIT, and mainly American and UK universities. But if we fast forward to almost now, the picture has changed dramatically. Again, Harvard is holding out at number 1, but the following 9 universities in the top 10 are now Chinese universities. So I wrote a report about this last year, and we in Sweden tend to process unexpected or bad news by challenging the method. So I included different types of data to look at to sort of come to a similar conclusion. And mindful of time, I didn't include this here, but I have the view graph if you want to see other ways of looking at this. But the point is that no matter which method you use and whatever objections you might have about a specific method, they all point in the very same direction. In my time in China, I've seen this sort of on the ground firsthand as well, right? The reason I moved to China in early 2004, some 22 years ago, was that my alma mater in Sweden, KTH Royal Institute of Technology, had just signed an agreement with Zhejiang University in China to set up a joint research center in the field of photonics, which is my original field of research. And I ended up going to China to, on the one hand, do my postdoc, but also to work on establishing this center. So there's 3 logos in the logo there. That's because Lund University joined at a later date, right? But at the time of establishment, it was KTH and ZJU University. And the reason or the rationale for setting up this center was different from the 2 sides, right? So from the Swedish side, a key rationale was that by quirk of the Swedish university system, PhD students are very expensive in Sweden, so research groups tends to not have that many. So working with a Chinese university opened the possibility of a large pool of highly talented, hardworking PhD students, right? So people from KTH saw the opportunity to just do more research, basically, right? There was another reason, which was basically, this seems like fun. From the Chinese side, a key motivation was at KTH, we had a large state-of-the-art clean room focused on optoelectronics and those materials that's used in that field, and all the surrounding know-how, etc. Right. A secondary reason for them was the international prestige that this kind of setup would give them, etc. So we had different reasons for joining this, and as they say in China, it was a win-win. So the situation when we started was that KTH was the senior partner, scientifically stronger, internationally recognized, a leading lab in Europe, right? Zhejiang University, by no means a bad lab, but they were the leading lab in China. But then time has moved on and things have changed. So by 2024, the situation was that on the Swedish side, the KTH was in this particular field was facing funding challenges, senior faculty retiring, low student numbers, limited replacement of faculty, which all amounted to sort of a fading strength in the research. Whereas Zhejiang University soared ahead, grew in size and capability, and is by now ranked by US News as the #1 university in the world in the field of optics, just ahead of Stanford University, as it were. So it's not a. It's telling what sometimes happens, right? That it's not a bad thing for KTH that their partner in China has turned out to be really good, but it's a sad fact that when sort of the students become the master, the teacher cannot capitalize on the student success, right? So KTH is not able to make use of this partnership. When we, as we increasingly do, see data that China is doing fantastically in science, one should remember that it's not going fantastically so far everywhere, right? So there's a few areas where China is still not a leading science nation. One is in the area of sort of translation of applied research into commercially viable innovation. This is a recognized problem in China. They are doing their best to sort of rectify a lot of things to make this better. Something is clearly going right because there is rapid improvement. If you look at, for instance, the Global Innovation Index, China entered the top 10 last year by being ranked as number 10, which is a significant improvement compared to 10, 15 years ago when China was down in the low 30s. Another area is curiosity-driven research, development of completely new ideas, where China is still rather behind Europe and the US. Perhaps in many ways not surprising. I mean, first of all, China is spending a much lower share of the research budget on basic science. They have recently started to rapidly increase the spending on basic science, but it's a recent development, and even though it's a rapid race, they're still below Europe and the US, right? And of course, also China has been up until basically yesterday been playing catch up, right? And that's not really the time in the development of a science nation when they do groundbreaking research, right? So the future will tell, right? We could have a discussion about, whether the political system in China is suitable for generating a lot of groundbreaking research. I would argue that, it's not certainly neither way, right? So we'll find out. But in these areas, China is still behind. So if we then go back to Sweden's situation, right? So if we look at the countries Sweden itself, but also our main scientific partners, and if you look at the quality of the research coming out of, Sweden and our partners, as measured by field-weighted citation impact. I don't know if all of you are cued in what this measure is, but if not, ask me in the Q&A and I'll explain. So Sweden is the dark blue line there. So we can see that our field-weighted citation impact is quite high, the highest among ourselves and our key partners. So we're doing quite well in terms of quality of our research. UK is doing quite well as well. They're quite close to us. Germany is slightly lower down, but it's maybe a recent reduction. China has, of course, the average impact of research in China has risen significantly over this past three decades. And what is unfortunately noticeable is another trend, which is that the US, the research here in the US is slowly but surely kind of declining in terms of impact. Right? So in 2003, the number was 1.59 here, but it's now down to 1.27, worryingly close to China there, right? So, and this of course means something for Sweden, right? So if you look at our situation, right, as I mentioned, Sweden's university system is highly internationalized, and we are very small, so we're highly dependent on our partnerships to maintain our research excellence, right? So what happens with our partners matters tremendously to us, right? So, and looking at our key partner, I'm from Sweden, we're afraid of conflict, so I stole a quote from somewhere else instead of, but this is from a report from Clarivate that was published in December last year, and you could read the following, that the United States appears in decline as a research partner, its growth has weakened, citation impact is falling, it may be losing its dominant lead in global research. And I should point out that this conclusion is based on data that predates the current administration in the US. So if you're from Sweden, we should maybe, try to do some sort of risk analysis of what's the state of our partners. So if you look at our top four partners, so I've already talked about the United States, but, still a world-leading place when it comes to science, but there's slowing or stagnation going on. And when it comes to the openness to collaboration, there are changes in government policy that are not, quite frankly, not positive, right? So for Sweden, if you talk about a strategic risk for Sweden, it's rising if we look at the United States. When it comes to UK, well, they're doing high impact research. The growth is not very, very strong. They're open, globally oriented. One could argue that a strategic risk in the UK, when it comes to the UK, might be classified as moderate. That has mainly to do with financial challenges within the UK university system. We may end up in a situation where UK starts contracting, right? Germany, they do, they're Germans, right? High quality, and they keep going. It's fairly stable, and they're also part of the European Union, so which we also are. So I would argue a low strategic risk for us. When it comes to China, well, in terms of research performance, we've seen rapid growth, rising impact. They are quite open. They are very, very. If you talk to government officials in China and also university leaders, they are very well aware that international collaboration is extremely important for them, extremely valuable. It's been extremely helpful to reach the point where they are. Right, so they remain very interested in international partnerships, and given sort of the tussle they have with you, they're looking more and more on Europe. However, they are becoming increasingly strong themselves. So a risk for Sweden is that, given a very strong research system in China, they are, and also sort of what we call they also are focusing a lot on self-reliance, that there may be a time and come a day when we're not that relevant for them. If you don't think about anything and you look at these developments, one could come to the conclusion that, maybe we should just work more with China. Because being a small nation, highly internationally dependent, a lot of researchers at Swedish universities are also not Swedes, right? So and for Swedish universities to be able to be internationally competitive in the long run, we need to work with the best people in the world, and quite frankly, more and more of them are based in China. However, it is not that simple, right? There's a lot of factors complicating this picture. One is that there's business competition. Sweden's economy, not only Swedish science is highly international, but Swedish economy is extremely internationalized as well. About 50% of Swedish GDP derives from exports. We have very strong companies in Sweden, but they are dependent on good R&D and whatnot. So there's the competition issue. Public opinion matters too. Swedes tend to not be that happy with China to date. They do these global opinion polls, what people think about China, and I don't remember which year it was, but a few years ago, the only country in the world that had a lower opinion about China was Japan, right? So I guess that says something. The mood is shifting in Europe rather rapidly now about who we like and who we don't, which has a lot to do with what happens here, but that may spill over to what people think about China. We'll see about that. But there are in Sweden, as well as here, national security concerns, and there are also global geopolitics, outside our national security concerns. I mean, it's not unfeasible to see a situation in the near-term future where Swedish scientists working in at least a select number of fields might actually have to choose, right? Should we work with American scientists? If we do, then maybe we cannot work with Chinese and vice versa, right? So it's not quite that easy. So what does Sweden actually think about China and collaboration with China? Well, it's a mixed picture, right? So on the one hand, whatever people are thinking and whatever is happening, collaboration is still growing, right? So people are still working more. The number of co-publications between Sweden and China plateaued briefly during COVID, but then has kept on rising since. Swedish scientists who work with China are quite happy with their partnerships. Overall, there are some exceptions, but a big chunk of the collaborations are in the STEM fields and tends to be easier to work with China in those fields. There was a recent survey done by the Swedish National China Center, a government think tank, that came to that conclusion that Swedish researchers are overall very happy with their partnership with China and happy with the results, right? On the funding front, Sweden has had several joint Sino-Swedish joint funding programs to promote Sino-Swedish research partnerships. All of them are at the moment gone for various reasons. I know the Swedish Research Council is working on reviving a partnership they had with National Science Foundation of China that stalled during COVID. So we'll see what happens there. But in society, there's kind of a general concern about research partnership with China. I mean, if we look at society at large outside the academic community, there's some concerns within also. There's some political obstacles. The security services are not always that happy. So there's challenges to do these partnerships. So I would classify that sort of the overall situation is there's some sort of policy ambivalence in Sweden of what should we actually do with China. And we're facing challenges also then to develop some sort of policy. What do we actually think? We as in Sweden as a nation and what the government thinks. And there are several problems with developing policy. One is, well, the world is changing quickly, right? So it's really hard to be proactive. So whatever is done tends to be, if anything is done, it tends to be reactive. There's a lack of understanding of China in Sweden. There's pockets of understanding, but if you look at the political class as a sort of an institutional understanding, there is a lingering assumption that Sweden is scientifically stronger than China. Let's not give away our secrets, and give away our strength here, right? So, and also there's a lack of understanding outside academia how international research partnerships work. And I did some pictures on this just to explain, right? Because if you look at public discourse in newspapers or not in Sweden, this is how they talk right now. Sweden works with China, which, of course, is not true. It's not the Kingdom of Sweden having a formal partnership with the People's Republic of China. But that is how people typically tend to think about this. It's slightly more correct to say that universities collaborate, right? But even then, so university partnerships, what are those? They're about students exchange, maybe some joint educational program, the occasional joint research center, and very rarely, which is not something that's been done in Sweden, a joint branch campus or something. But the bulk of partnership is actually a grassroots thing. It happens at individual level. It's researchers working with researchers in Sweden and in China, or any country with any other country. And so now I couldn't do a map anymore, so it's more symbolic. But so the big circles are now countries, the small circles are universities, and the dots are researchers. So this is how a international research network looks like, right? So there's connections going on all over between research at different universities and in different countries. And this is how a research network looks from the point of view of the government or a security agency. But from the point of view of a scientist, it just looks like this, right? It's just a network of people. And if one black dot moves from one corner to the other, the network looks exactly the same. And I think, so of course, these two viewpoints needs to be reconciled somehow, because, and a mistake that Swedish universities have done, and I wouldn't be surprised if American universities done the same, is that we've only viewed the right-hand network, and we've argued that anybody who thinks differently, they are wrong. And that has meant that when the world of science grew and Sweden started to work with people at universities further away from Sweden, they did it in exactly the same way. However, it is actually a difference working with a scientist in Denmark than with a scientist in China. There's, different legal systems, and, there's a whole, as we all know now, there's a whole host of issues, right? Swedish universities were a little bit late to come to that realization. So there's been a bit of a backlash from government and society about those practices. But of course, government and security agencies need to understand that this is the way scientists think and operate, right? So we've at STINT, we've worked on developing a framework we call responsible internationalization, right? So how to manage risk in a system that works internationally and whose default logic is openness, right? So there's several reasons why we started working with this, not necessarily research security, but we launched this concept in 2020, and we've written a couple of reports to sort of, flesh that out a little bit more. but it's a framework on how to think about proactively what you're getting yourself into and why you're doing it. What are the obstacles? What can go wrong, etc. Right? So it's a toolkit to enable researchers to continue do what they want to do and what they should do, and it's taken root in the Swedish university system. If you go visit a major Swedish university's website, they will probably have a page that says, our work on responsible internationalization. The Swedish government launched an official inquiry a year or so ago, 2 years ago, maybe, where they tasked a few Swedish government agencies to develop a national framework on how to utilize this as a toolkit for continued international engagement. Right? We at STINT feel that given this, our job is a little bit done. We thought about this. We launched a concept. So, but as sort of a parting thing, we funded 2 research groups at 2 different Swedish universities to develop sort of a deeper and broader understanding and knowledge about this. So yeah, so that's kind of a little bit the view from Sweden. So to summarize, we're doing good science in Sweden, and one big reason that we're able to do good science is that we do a lot of partnerships internationally, right? And to continue doing good science, we need to continue partnerships, and we need to do it with the best people that we can work with, right? And it might just be that relying on our traditional partners only might not be sufficient for maintaining excellence in the future, might even be earlier than in the long term, right? An obvious solution, which is not obvious and not simple, is to work more with China, but it's fraught with complications. And of course, there's a lot of other science nations to work with, and we do that. At STINT, we're, for instance, funding partnerships with Korea, Japan, etc. No, sorry, Japan is not really a new science nation. Korea, Singapore, whatnot, right? And sort of the national toolkit that we are looking at right now to enable us to continue to do research, despite sort of, as I said, the choppy geopolitical waters, is this framework of responsible internationalization. But one should be clear, we're figuring this out as we go, and we don't have, I would argue, not really figured it out in a fantastic way yet. But anyway, so yeah, I'll stop there and
Thank you for a superb presentation, Erik. Before we turn it over to the room, I want to pull on a comment that you dropped that was very tantalizing to me when you were talking about how the relationship between KTH and ZJU University has flipped. And you said something, and I wrote it down, that says KTH can't make use of the partnership now. Yeah. Can you explain why that is, and do you regard that as emblematic of the Swedish-China research experience now? Why is it asymmetric, and what is KTH doing to try to change that?
No, so I would say that overall, as I mentioned somewhere else, that Sweden's collaboration with China is growing. In our particular case, KTH is not really able to capitalize on the gain the student has done because the group is shrinking, the resources are shrinking, right? And so that is, yeah, that's the situation there. And that could be a situation, a broader situation. Right now, the Swedish university system, in terms of, output and whatnot, it's still growing. But, one could not presume that we will continue to be an interesting partner to work with.
Yeah. I want to back out a little bit because it's very easy for the conversation to be focused purely on China.
Always the problem,
right?
Yes.
so let's shift it actually into a slightly different geography, a geography that's much closer to you, that's getting much more interesting from a security perspective, that is the Arctic. And in particular, events since 2022. Your policy, STINT's policy on responsible internationalization, was written in 2020. Do you feel that it was an adequate guide to managing the relationship with Russia? And if not, what have you learned from that experience, and how has the environment in the region with regard to, say, research in the Arctic changed in light of the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I mean, one thing that has happened after the invasion of Ukraine is that Sweden has officially canceled all research partnerships with Russia. So I don't know, the toolkit of responsible internationalization is not really applicable in that situation.
But did it prepare Swedish institutions in the 2 years?
I would say no. No.
I would say so what lessons could be learned from that?
Well, I mean, it's a continued struggle. Looking at what Swedish universities does from the outside is that they are continuously reactive rather than proactive. I sometimes struggle to figure out a good solution. We can obviously not really walk into Swedish universities and tell them how they should manage their day-to-day operations, but sometimes you're quite tempted. Sorry for flipping back to China now, but in my experience of having been in China, when I came there 22 years ago, people were really not really understanding why would you go to China to do research partnerships. But over the years after, people started coming to China, university management, delegations and whatnot. And every time they came, they discovered China and realized that something interesting is happening here. We should do something. Then they went home, forgot about it, and came back a few years later and realized exactly the same thing, right? So Swedish universities, we are trying hardest to make them work more strategically, right? And they really, really should.
Before turning, I want to just take advantage of the fact that we have fewer and fewer people who are spending long periods of time in China from the West now, who have that longitudinal perspective. If I were to ask you to identify 2 or 3 things that have changed most dramatically in the last handful of years, as Xi Jinping has really kicked the Chinese S&T system into overdrive and has sort of made that high stakes gamble on high quality productive forces and techno-nationalism, what would you say the biggest sort of leaps forward, borrow a term, that China has made in the last, say, 3 or 4 years have been? Just curious.
Well, as I forgot who said that, but somebody here in the United States who knows China well said that it helps to pour money on science, and they really have, and you can really feel it. That funding and resources is a non-issue. Of course, I am at Zhejiang University, one of the top universities in China, so we're perhaps more well treated than others, but it really is something in the system, and you can travel around in China. And I don't know how many brand new campuses I've visited in recent years. It's, of course, long term, perhaps not sustainable given what happens to the population and whatnot. But it's incredible to say the least, right? And so that is the most noticeable thing, right? And of course, there's people coming back to China too. When I came to China, they instituted this kind of talent. Well, had been in operation for some time when I came to China the first time, but the rationale for this program was obvious, right? Because if you were a student from China, came to the US, you did your PhD, you stayed on, you did your postdoc, you were working at Stanford or wherever, going back to China at that time was professional suicide. You were leaving one of the world leading research environment, going back to nothing in China. And so then the Chinese government understood this. So we'll give you this instead. Right? We'll give you a big bag of money, high salary, high status, build your group, right? So that convinced enough people to go back. But over the time I've been here, that has become less and less necessary. People come back on their own, for own reasons. More recently, they've perhaps start to feel less welcome, at least here, but that's a very recent phenomenon. People have really started to come back because they want to come back. And that's another change I've seen. So.
Thank you. Please, open to the room.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. Yeah. My name is Tom Hendricks. I'm a senior fellow emeritus here. I wanted to ask you about when you gave those figures at the beginning of your talk. What part of that is military? I mean, Sweden has a fairly good arms industry, and I was wondering about what any comments you want to make on that. And finally, I just wonder if you could just kind of give us a look at how Sweden's handling AI. artificial intelligence, because that's now the big thing. And in the United States, on our front page of almost every newspaper every day. So those are just two.
If you're referring to the publication numbers, those comes from the SciVay database from LSFU, which just catalogs peer-reviewed academic collaboration publications, right? So, to the extent that people from military universities publish, in peer-reviewed journals, that would be in there, but otherwise, perhaps not, right? I have no breakdown on numbers. I don't know if my colleagues have, but on what share of Swedish R&D budget goes to military, I would presume quite low numbers. But when it comes to AI, well, it's easier for us because, quite frankly, we're not that good at it as compared to the United States and China. We're far behind, right? The concerns in Sweden when it comes to AI is not so much are we falling behind China, right, as it is here, or how do we stay ahead of China? Our concerns are more about the implementations, what happens to society when, et cetera, right? Those kind of concerns.
Thank you so much for the informative talk. I just was looking at this. So the factors for complications about collaboration, there was nothing about academic freedom. So it seems to me that I don't know if the collaboration means only science collaboration or also social science and the humanities. But even if it's only science, is it really possible to separate? I don't know how those rankings goes, because it seems like for a country without any academic freedom, and if you look at Hong Kong last night, they just sentenced Jimmy Lai for 20 years. So how can that be separated from all the rankings and the rationale when you think about collaboration? And I think for those of us who have been in the field for long enough, when we talk about Swedish government, immediately we'll think about the Causeway Bay booksellers being adopted by the CCP. And at that time, I think the Swedish government was not being very helpful, and he's still in jail, of course. So I just wonder if any of this had been taken into consideration, or if it's not even part of the discussion when you consider collaboration.
No. So yeah, thank you for that comment. This is an oversight from my it should actually be in the list because it is part of the discussion. Research collaboration between Sweden and China has a heavy tilt towards the hard sciences, the natural science and engineering sciences, for several reasons. One is, again, partly our fault, perhaps, because our joint funding program with NSFC in China only funded those fields, not because we fund science across all fields. However, our partner NSFC only funds the hard sciences. We actually looked for a partner in the social sciences, but we failed to find one that was useful to work with. But also, us aside, the partnerships, the research partnerships that happens between Sweden and China has a very strong tilt towards engineering and natural science, which is partly because of what the Chinese side is interested in working with Sweden with, which goes back partly to a problem of what Swedish universities does, because as I mentioned, they tend to be very reactive, right? They're not really thinking about who do we want to work with, for what reason, and et cetera, et cetera. Then, of course, it is harder to work in the social sciences with China, so that perhaps draws down the amount of collaboration as well. But yes, there is a discussion within academia mostly about the merits of working with China due to academic freedom. It's when you meet people from the social sciences and the natural sciences, you meet very different experiences in the partnerships with China. A person from engineering and natural sciences would typically be quite enthusiastic. They have lots of resources, lots of students, lots of equipment. It's great. They work fast. They publish fast. It's fantastic. No limitations on whatsoever. And that is actually generally true if you work with people in the natural sciences. They have more or less full research. I mean, not perhaps academic freedom, but research freedom, right? They can choose to work with whatever they want. In the social sciences, the picture is very much different. But overall, social scientists in Sweden, they're not in China that much. So they're sort of admiring the problem from afar. Yeah. But true. I stand corrected. It should have been there because it is part of the discussion.
Thanks for laying out this really tricky Gordian knot. Because I think, as I reflect on the US situation and maybe the Swedish situation, I'm tempted to step back. You know, in the United States now, we're having a broader conversation about the nature of particularly university research enterprise and the social compact. You know, what are universities here for? Who enables us to do that research? You know, is it for economic benefit? Is it for the people who support taxpayer-funded research? Is it for the interests of the researchers themselves and their desire to be at the leading edge of knowledge? And I wonder if that helps offer a guide to some of the public opinion measures that you outline here in Sweden, or the views of the researchers. How does that play in Sweden as you think about prioritizing different research partners? Are you having the same renegotiation of the relationship between the research community and the innovation community and the general public and the government, or is that something that's off the table and doesn't provide a guide in this situation?
We in Sweden tend to copy what you do here in the US, right? Typically at a later date and at a smaller scale, but the disconnect and distrust that exists between the public and us at universities exist in Sweden too. The amplitude of the problem is smaller, and I think when we look at the public opinions, thinking about who we should work with the severe risk of silencing elitists, but the rationale for distrusting China and when it comes to research partnerships from the public is not very sophisticated or very deep, right? So that doesn't mean there is not cause for concern, but it's just a general feeling, right? We could have a better discussion overall in Sweden about who we should work with and for what purpose. Overall, we don't tell our researchers who they should work with, right? But of course, when it comes to the public's potential distrust with Sweden, we have one situation that is very different from here, because as a parent, you don't really need to worry about what's the worth of sending my kids to university, because a parent in Sweden will not pay very high tuition fees, and so they go there for free, right? So that I think that is one. Perhaps I haven't thought this through. I'm just thinking out loud right now, but I think that matters too when it comes to the public's perception of universities. Yeah, I don't know if that was a good answer.
First of all, I'm Phil Buxbaum from the physics department. Actually, my area is also photonics. So I'm particularly interested in your remarks and very, very clear-eyed view. I wanted to ask about the issue of openness, which is not quite the same as freedom. It's the opportunity, or maybe the reluctance, of working with Chinese counterparts because they are either not allowed or don't want to tell you everything they know. And we can't really do science in a collaborative way unless everybody tells everybody everything that they know. Can you comment on that?
I mean, my experience when I interact with my colleagues at ZJU University is that they, by and large, are happy naive researchers as any one of us in any country, right? They're there for the science because they enjoy doing it, right? And typically that's what motivates them, right? None of my colleagues, I believe, wakes up in the morning and thinks, "What can I do for the party today?" Right? They want to go do their work. I had this interesting conversation with our vice dean just after China opened up after COVID, and he was going to he did part of his PhD in Sweden, and it was very clear we got that instructions came from higher up that kicked the international partnerships into gear again, right? So he was going to go back to Sweden, talk to former colleagues, see what he can do. And I tried to explain to him, like, look, the world has changed a little bit during COVID. The general public opinion in the world about China is not as positive as it used to be. You might need to be mindful of this when you go back to Sweden. And he completely didn't understand what I was talking about, because all he thought was, well, we're just doing science, right? This has nothing to do with us. So I think one shouldn't overthink individual scientists' sort of allegiance to the party and what they do. Of course, they do operate in the political system within China, but their main motivation, of course, there are exceptions to the rule, right? But their main motivation are exactly the same as a scientist in Sweden or here, right? We want to do good science. I've seen a shift recently. I mean, I come from from physics, so I don't know the situation at a social science department. I never have, right? But I'm aware that the relationship to the politics of the day, if you're at a social science department, is rather different than if you work at a physics department. But so their research is politicized to a degree. That is not the case at a physics department. The daily life of a scientist at a physics department is becoming more politicized. I share a room with another associate professor, and on his desk is the normal stack of papers to grade and papers to read and general disorder. But on top of those piles, in this past couple of years, are also a stack of red books. Xi Jinping thought on this and this and that. Right? They do have to go to political education meetings. I mean, they tend to view this as a nuisance, but it still encroaches on their daily life. So I wouldn't. I mean, I'm obviously not a party member. I don't go to their meetings, so I don't know exactly what they say in those meetings and how they decide on the way forward. But all the same, individual discussions with people, they are very much motivated by the science, or to a degree, the professor at my department, their aggrandizement of himself, but not necessarily, the political aspects of it.
That's not unknown outside of China either.
Yes, that's true.
There is another. I'm also in the physics department, and I'm Stephen Kivelson. There's another aspect of the relation that you didn't mention, and actually a place where I think China is at a disadvantage, which is that despite the fact that science is so good in China, still many of the very best students and scholars would love to come. Well, here we've become much less open to them, but it's an opportunity for Sweden, I'm sure, to recruit really outstanding people. That ties in with many of these questions of academic freedom. I think people really like being in free countries.
Well, yeah, I cannot argue with that. I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, as you all know, I mean, this is, I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure, but I mean, this has been one of the key strengths of the United States, right? You can attract the best of the best, and they want to come here. And you're, again, not you personally, but you're at risk of squandering that. And
I think our numbers would have been much worse without the contributions of the Chinese scholars we managed to attract here.
Oh yes, of course. I mean, there's numerous studies on this, right? That even research partnerships between U.S. and Chinese scholars, where the Chinese partner is a junior partner, the contribution is significant. And it's one thing for Chinese to go back to China, but I've lived in China on and off for the better part of 22 years. My wife is Chinese. My son was born there. So I'm as embedded in society as you can be as a non-Chinese, but that is still, you're still a guest always, will never be anything different. So they may be able to attract a large part of Chinese back to China, but if they're going to be a true global center of science, a lot of other people need to come, and there they have a big challenge.
I think even for Chinese, there are many of them that would happily move.
Steve, did you have a question?
Who owns your intellectual property? So you work in China for a Chinese university.
Yeah.
What are the rules and laws governing the output of the lab, papers that are written, the applications, the intellectual property regime in general. I imagine that when they come to Sweden, they take advantage of the fact that you're a rule of law country. There's a court system. There's transparent agreements about who owns intellectual property, or at least what percentage of the intellectual property is owned by the university where they work, by the individual who works there. How does it work in your case or in the case in general of Swedish collaboration with the Chinese? What happens to the intellectual property, including the intellectual property of Chinese researchers in Sweden?
Am I right that Swedish researchers own their own IP?
Yes. So Sweden is fairly unique in that we have something called the teacher exception. So if you are a faculty member at a Swedish university, any IP you develop, you personally own. And that has nothing to do with your, the passport you own. It has to do with the fact that you're a faculty member at a Swedish university. Now in China, it's different. Any IP that's generated from you as an employee of the university there belongs to the university. I presume practices differ from different universities, but at ZJU University, where I am, although the university owns the IP, the individual scientist who actually contributed to the IP has a big say in if they want to sell it, who to sell it to, and if the IP is sold, there's a deal between the university and the researchers so the researcher will get a certain percentage of the price what was paid. How large the percentage is, I don't know, and it probably depends on who you are as a professor and your connections and whatnot. When it comes to partnerships between Sweden and China, how do you sort that out? Well, the easiest way is because patents are tied to geography, right? So I've seen partnerships where they just do like this, right? So we file for a patent, you guys get the EU patent, we file here in China. But that has to be, there's no bilateral agreement between Sweden and China, so it's something that has to be worked out by the scientists involved in a collaboration. And unfortunately, what I've seen is that the Chinese side in a partnership tends to be much more focused on this than the Swedish side. But that is the loss of the Swedish side. They should have known better.
So I think. Go ahead.
Can you control your intellectual property in the Chinese system as far as you're concerned? In other words, there are some meetings that you're not going to?
Yeah. Well, I haven't filed for any patents in China, so personally, but of course, if I file for a patent based on research I've done at ZJU University, the university will own it. It'll be in practice more challenging for me to keep track, get the money back, because I don't know necessarily the right people. I do speak Chinese, but I'm not fluent, so but it's a question of, it's more challenging for me to navigate the system. But if I, put an effort to it and talk to the right people, of course I could protect my rights, to the extent there exists, given that the IP actually belongs to the university, and my influence over what happens to it is by the good graces of the university.
And optics has military applications.
Does.
Obviously. So all Chinese universities by law collaborate with the PLA at the PLA's request. It's not like they can avoid that potential collaboration. So you're researching, don't know your research personally, so this is just an abstract discussion. This is not a personal. If there are military applications for your optics research, you were in the Swedish context, you would have a certain amount of control over whether that research was used or not by the Swedish military. You might say yes to a request. In the Chinese case, I wonder how one could control it.
So in the Swedish context, I would have total control because I personally own the patent. Yes. In the Chinese context, I don't theoretically have zero control.
Wouldn't that be an issue front and center in the rules or recommendations governing cooperation? No? I mean, everyone's entering into the collaborations knowingly until something happens that they didn't anticipate.
So let me ask a question back. The situation here in the US is the same, right? I mean, if you develop IP here, that would belong to Stanford.
There's an agreement that you negotiate with Stanford. How much of it is Stanford's versus how much of it is yours if there are commercial or other applications. There is a strict rule regime in place that our scientists can explain to you that when you work in the lab, Stanford owns the lab, so part of it is Stanford owns the output.
Yeah, it's a worked out fraction, and I wish I had enough patents that I could just rattle off the percentage, but I don't. But there is a percentage that's retained by the individual. Percentage goes to the department, and a percentage is retained by the university.
When you say percentage, you mean ownership of the IP or revenue generated by sales?
Yeah, licensing.
Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, this model is being studied very closely by China because they regard it as extremely productive.
Yeah.
But I think there's a separate question about money and the ideas. I mean, in the university, we publish our ideas. It's not like they're secret.
Okay. Just to be sure, I think everyone around here knows that all patents are public. Therefore, they don't violate any Stanford rules against having only public research.
So we are at time. I know there are a few more questions, and I hope that our guest will stay for a few extra minutes to entertain those questions in private discussion.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much, Erik, for joining us and for sharing the Swedish experience.
Thank you.